Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Neuro-Inclusive Dog Pod, the podcast where we bridge the gap between neurodiversity and the dog world. Today, I've got a really interesting guest for you, and I'm sure that everybody listening is going to get a huge amount from listening to this episode. And when we did our pre-podcast chat, it's something that I align with on a certain level, but I don't know as much about this next guest that's going to come on and tell you even more than I've already possibly spoken about in the past. So welcome to my podcast, Victoria. Could you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, of course. So I am a people and pet therapist, a medium and healer, and I combine everything I'm trained in, really. So all the modalities and therapies with the work that I do, as it says in the title, working with pets and their owners. So I help pets and their owners heal emotional and behavioural issues by mainly kind of working with the pet, but also with the owners as well. But I don't just work with living pets, so I do also work with grieving pet parents as well, who are struggling with the loss of their pets. And I help them basically to heal the wounds that get triggered often with their loss, to release stuck emotions and much more kind of surrounding that, really, just to such that they can gain more peace, more sort of understanding and actually healing to move forwards with more ease and more light and more grace. So I do obviously work with that duality.
Amazing. So it's quite a unique way of working. What led you to work in this way, and what made you go into this particular area?
So we were made redundant back in 2014, and I at that moment kind of was at a crossroads, and I chose at that time, like you do, to kind of follow where my heart was taking me, which was working with therapies. I'd already done a bit of life coaching sort of a couple of days, and I was like, oh, I really like that, I like psychology. So I started training in kind of human therapies and starting to walk that path. And then basically what happened from there is I was actually watching somebody doing energy healing with a tiger on YouTube, and I burst into tears, and I was like, okay, that's not a normal response for something like that. And so I did some journaling, I did some inner child work on it, and basically my inner child said that she was really cross that I wasn't still working with animals. So I should also say, prior to being made redundant, I had spent 8 years in the veterinary referral industry, and I've always been around animals in some guise, one way or the other, whether that's professional or just personal. So she was basically really cross that I wasn't working with animals, and that gave me a real humdinger of a moment where you go, oh, that is a valid point. I love being around, pets and animals. And I basically vowed to her that absolutely I would do my very best to get back into that, but it would take time. And it really sort of was from there. Everything has been very gradual. So I trained in different therapies. I started training, well, I trained in hypnotherapy, then found that there was a lady that actually did canine hypnotherapy with dogs, and I was like, oh, that sounds amazing. So I trained in that. Then sort of in my personal life, I'd already started communicating with animals, but didn't, like you do, didn't realize that that was a thing, that it was possible, until somebody actually told me that that's what I was doing. A medium basically I had a reading with said, you are communicating with animals and you're going to use this in your business. So I went and trained in that. I was already trained in energy healing. So it's been a flow in that regard, as to working with animals. With regards to actually what I do working with pets and their owners, I would say that kind of the crux point for that would be that when my original cat Phoebe passed away in 2016, I, at the time, had a very kind of mild UTI, and I had this epiphany, basically, that actually every time I seemed to have something like that, so did she. And I was like, okay, that's a bit interesting. And from there, me starting to think, is that possible? Can they take things from us? Or is it just that we're in the same situation and she's, responding to it in the same way as me? So I was getting quite curious, and spirit started to, or the universe, whatever way you want to name it, started to send me examples that was the case, that yes, actually it's possible, because we know everything is energy. And so if everything is energy, and if we start looking then into the metaphysics, which is obviously quite a deep topic to go into with regards to conditions, medical conditions, human conditions of the body, we then start to realize, well, if everything's energy, then yes, that makes it a lot more possible that they can absorb energy from us, the same as if somebody out there, and certainly myself as well, and possibly even yourself as well, when you're very empathic and highly sensitive, very often you will absorb energy and emotions from other people without even realizing you're doing it. And then you'll come away from the supermarket going, why do I suddenly feel really angry? That's really odd. You know, there was nothing in there that's triggered me. And often it's because somebody's just walked through your energy field, which surrounds us, and we sort of, you know, we've taken that on. So that was kind of the first point. And then it's really built from there, that actually the more clients I've worked with, I started to see more of the mirrors. So I had one lady when I was doing canine flow training where she said she had a shoulder problem on her. Her dog had a shoulder problem on the left. And I said to her, do you have any problem yourself with your shoulder on the left? And she said, no, mine's on the right. But my doctor did say it's referred from the left. So I've had quite a lot of that. I've had even myself with, you know, pets I've looked after, you know, I've felt their issues. Or had similar issues as well. So if they've got bad right hip, I've got bad right hip. You know, and that's certainly the case with my beautiful baby Puss. She did have a right hip issue, and I've got a right hip issue. So so I've also seen a lot of it in that regard. And it's just, you know, gradually come on board. The more and more you work with that, the more and more the universe kind of sends those things to you to show you that, yes, absolutely, you know, they are our mirrors and our messengers.
Yeah, definitely. Super interesting. So if anybody's listening that's new to all of this and doesn't really know much about it, can you explain quite simply how it is that you work with people and their pets?
Yes. So like we've kind of been saying, so I tend to go in with okay, what's the mirror or what's the message? That's really kind of the main thing I'm looking for when I work with pets, because there's always one there. So that's the main thing I work with. Obviously a lot of that comes about from them filling in the consultation forms. I'm looking at what they're advising me. I'm looking at the symptoms. If there's something that is more of a physical condition, then I have a great metaphysics book by Vet Rose called Metaphysical Anatomy that I actually then look up. So I will look at that element of it. So I'm always kind of looking, because often it can be like quite simple. So it might be, if you've got an anxious pet, you've very likely got an anxious owner somewhere in the mix, whether that's the person you're speaking to or someone else within the household. It might be if you've got two dogs, for instance, or two pets, but it might be one dog takes after the wife and the other dog takes after the husband, or you know, the two children, things like that. So I'm always kind of looking for those elements, and then I start working with that. And often again it will be quite organic, because very often, you know, people aren't aware that there is even a mirror. They aren't necessarily aware that their pet is trying to tell them something. So it's really my job to start working with that and start looking at that. So I suppose it's probably easier to give you an example in some respects, but just before I do, what I tend to do is, with everything I'm trained in, whether that's for human therapy or an animal therapy, I work with whatever is best to get the results that we need. So I will use human therapies with animals, and sometimes animal therapies to a point with humans, but it's more the other way around, basically. So for instance, one example, I was somewhere recently at an event, and I was doing like mini one-to-ones, animal communication, and I spoke to one doggy that basically said that they felt a bit kind of useless in a way. They didn't really feel needed. They needed a purpose. They felt really kind of stuck and frustrated, and that was making them anxious as well, and often a little bit reactive also because of that frustration. And the thing is, as soon as a pet says a certain thing, because I'm kind of highly attuned into knowing that there's mirrors and messages, there'll just be certain words that kind of jump out at me, or just one thing that a pet says and I'm like, okay, I know where we're going now. And so like when they kind of said that, I was like, right, bear with me a second. I'd want to feel into this deeper. And then as soon as I did that, I was able to say to the owner, can you understand that you've lost direction in your life, that you feel stuck, that you feel frustrated, that you feel like you're not doing what you should be doing in life, and you don't have a purpose, you know? And then it opened up this whole massive conversation of, in a sense, like a career transition, to a point, a life transition, you know, in terms of changing lifestyles and things. So it often works kind of very much like that. Where either the dog or whatever pet I'm working with, could be a horse, a chicken, you know, says something in particular where you go, boom, now we're at it, now we've got there. Or it might be that because of the emotions that they are displaying, often when a pet is very emotionally expressive, whether that's in a healthy way or not, seen by the owner, it normally means that there is unresolved emotions within the owner. And very often that kind of then leads to us talking about past traumas, often
Yeah.
childhood issues. So I've also had that before, where actually when you start working on that, you know, if people are holding on to shame, for instance, that's a very low vibrational emotion. It's a very dense emotion. It's a very strong emotion as well, same as anger is. So often, you know, when it's a very strong and intense emotion, you'll find that whatever behavior the pet is doing, that they're trying to show the owner there's something there, will be more intense. You know, and I've had that basically. And when we started working on the issue, the dog completely stopped what they were doing, came and sat on the settee and held space for the owner whilst we were working through and trying to help them release emotions. And there was still much more to work on. But so this is what I'm looking at, you know, and this is, it could be things like, I'm just thinking of like little snippets from, you know, that will help people. So it might be, I've had a cat before that said, I feel trapped.
Right.
And it massively triggered the owner. So when she heard that, you know, all of these things that I do for them, you know, and there's two things going on there. So number one, it's the trigger itself, you know, which is something that we then work with. And number two, it's also, where does that person feel trapped in their own life? And both of those they could take. So they did feel trapped and listed off various ways they felt trapped. But also it was to do with the trigger around, why is it that them saying they feel trapped, how is that triggering you? And often it's well, it's like everything I do for them is not good enough. You know, and then as soon as you then lead into that, okay, so who in your life has made you feel that way? Oh, my mum or my dad or my teacher or whoever it might be, you know. So we're working very much with like unhealed wounds. And it can also happen with pets in spirit as well. So very often the way a pet will pass is often triggering an unhealed loss within us. So I had a lady around me, her pet passed through a road traffic accident, and she was the first lady actually who I just felt kind of that I needed to ask a question. And I said to her, where else have you had a sudden loss like this that has caused these kind of emotions to occur, like the shock and the grief and just massive trauma? And she said, well, my parents were killed in a car crash.
Wow.
And I'm getting goosebumps. I don't know whether you are, but you know, so and you know, I know I'm smiling, but I'm not smiling obviously that's happened. But you know, that's the kind of thing that can occur, is they, you know, the souls on that soul level have chosen in this life to have that contract. If I'm going to pass in this way, because then that will trigger that unhealed loss within you, because maybe at the time, if you were a child, you weren't able to work through those emotions, or there wasn't the counselling services to help. So it works in that way. And also, you know, people who you know, have lost their pet might also have issues around abandonment or regrets or guilt, or you know, believing it's their fault, or many other things, which again can lead back to unhealed wounds that they already have. You know, if they've been in a dysfunctional family unit where they've constantly believed everything's their fault, and it's sort of a toxic nature in the family, you know, that can kind of come in. So that's kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's probably the best way I can try and do that. Is I'm generally looking for those mirrors and those messages. Yes, absolutely, pets do have their own traumas. So you know, but again, quite often, for instance, if you have a rescue pet coming in, if they have abandonment issues because of what they've been through, quite often they're coming into a family where somebody within the household, normally the person that's closest to them, also has abandonment issues. You know, so again, it can be very parallel in the way that they're coming in. And then it's really, again, that you've chosen on a soul level to come in together to help heal those issues. So I hope that's helped answer the question.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that when we had our pre-podcast chat, it was like, I was so interested in this because I talk a lot in my work. Let's just take my agility hat about, so traditional agility, everybody thinks about skills, about the equipment and stuff, and then I realized quite early on in my training, both my dogs and when I was training to be a teacher as well, that there's a lot more to it than that. It isn't just the skills, it's the whole, I always describe it as like a jigsaw, and the dog's got its own little jigsaw, the human's got his own jigsaw as well, and those jigsaws need to align together perfectly. But what I find as well, especially doing competitive agility, and it's something that I've looked at and had experience from a personal experience, but also from those with many clients, is that dogs are our mirrors. It's something that I talk about a lot, and I always say to people, like, you know, whatever's happening in the ring, yes, it may be a behavioural issue, it may be a training issue, but 9 times out of 10 it is something that the handler is giving off. It's something that and then the dog's picking up on it. So with my young dog, I have suffered from anxiety for years and years. So the reason I first got Milo was the fact that I was so anxious I couldn't leave the house. Anyway, transfer that now to the young dog I've got now, and he's extremely anxious, getting better at it. But we had an incident where I was working on his anxiety, but also knew I needed to work on my anxiety as well. And I think becoming a trainer and being a trainer and doing agility behavior, it also brings that next level of pressure. So it's like I was like, yeah, brilliant. I was sorting his stuff out, and then there was a particular incident last year that I went to a certain show, and there was two people there that I thought, right, we've got our stuff sorted out now. I've worked on my stuff. We're doing all right. We're doing all right at these competitions. Went to this particular show and saw two people that had given me a hard time in the past. And I just thought, come on, Katrina, you've done this before. He's all right. Anyway, he got on the start line. I led out and he just completely froze. And it was the complete worst ever round that we've ever had. He flipped on his back and he wouldn't move. And it was like, oh my God, what are you doing? I've never hurt you at all. Why are you doing this? And it was just complete car crash. And it was that moment I realized, you know what? I've got things I haven't dealt with here. And I had to like go away and deal with all of that and works on my stuff. And it's like that slowly rebuilding that, we'd sort, as far as I knew, we'd sorted his anxiety out, and he was doing really well. He was bringing in rosettes and stuff until I got to this one particular show. I saw these two people, and then it all just like crumbled. I'm like, I know what's going off now. It's not his issue, it's just mine. So that's like, and I know, well, I say I know all of this. I know a certain amount of this because I've had this with previous dogs, and I know how I'm very open to how human, my background was human counselling and psychology before I got into the world of dogs. So I'm very much open to all of that anyway. But when it comes to you helping pet owners that aren't particularly as aware of the stuff that we bring to the table, how do you help them to recognise those messages that the pets are giving them?
So there's probably lots of different techniques that I use. I mean, some of it is education. So even just sharing with people, that dogs have the biggest heart per body mass, that actually they the biggest ways that they sense the world is through electromagnetic fields. And it's not just dogs,
Right.
horses, cats, they're all sentient beings. They connect with the electromagnetic fields of the earth and also within ourselves, and therefore what happens is they are connecting to our energy. So that's like what I tend to say to people. And if people want to look it up, like Rupert Sheldrake is a great guy to look at. He calls it morphic resonance. I call it a group bond just because it's easier to understand. But on YouTube, if you type in his name, Rupert Sheldrake, and morphic resonance, you'll come up with some much more kind of scientific webinars, if you like, on it. But for me, the group bond is the fact that you have an energy field, they have an energy field, anybody else in the household has an energy field, and actually when you're around each other so much, they start to blend, they start to merge. So very often, you will see quite often, as I say, that pets will mirror certain people's personalities. Sometimes it's a mixture of people in the household, but if it's just like, say, one person, then they will tend to mirror them, and you'll find that they're quite similar. And I don't get away with this, absolutely not. Person mirrored me big time. So and all of the pets that I've had around me, and sometimes I've had to I was fostering two cats at one point, and I'd come back from my friends and they were just going nuts. And I was like, what the heck is going on? This is crazy. And because they were just like jumping all over the place. And, sort of, it was very much kind of, I'm going to get you, not if I get you first, and all of that. I was like, whoa. And of course, doing what I do, I was very much like, right, hang on, let me just feel into myself. And this is something that you can do yourselves, so it's kind of led us back to the question, because I do digress, sorry, sometimes it's just sort of the flow of the information, is I had to literally just sit there and go, right, and sort of really go within and tune into myself of how am I feeling. And I was feeling very antsy because I don't really drink caffeine, and I'd had a cup of tea round at a friend's, and so my energy was like all over the place, and that's what they were picking up on. So you can do that if it's it's quite a sudden change and there's no reason for it, like they've not hurt themselves in any way, or they've not fell off the settee or run into a fence, or something like that. Then maybe sort of sit and just close your eyes and feel into yourselves and go, right, how am I feeling? What's going on for me? And I think for the human population, sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, because we are so distracted with everything around us that we don't always do that. And it's a really good, good way of doing it. Often one of the ways I work with people to start to get them into that, apart from what I've just said about education and just tuning within, is breath work, breathing. So like, especially like if I've got a pet that's anxious, you know, and again, if I'm very empathic, I can often feel the owner's anxiety, and I can already feel that that's there. But obviously I can't just say to somebody, well, you're anxious. You know, that's going to be walled straight up, you know. So generally one of the things I will do is just ask the owner to just close their eyes for a moment and sit and breathe, and I just get them to breathe for about like 3 or 4 minutes, if that. And I watch how the pet responds, you know, and, you know, quite often you can see the dog sort of like, oh God. You know, and I'm like, boom, okay, so there's a massive connection here. And then I just get them to open their eyes and just say, okay, I just want you not to move, like, but just gently, like, look to your left or right or wherever their pet is, you know, and just notice what they're doing. And that in itself, quite often they're like, oh my God, you know, and they sort of realize that actually their pet is looking relaxed for the first time. So that could be another way. Sometimes it's a very sort of tiptoey process. So I had a mum and daughter that I went to see who had a doggy from abroad, and he'd been trapped in a fire. He'd ended up getting his collar and lead caught on a fence, and he ended up in this fire basically where the fire burnt right through to the bones of his paws. So he was, you know, pretty traumatized, as you can imagine. They'd not been able to actually get him to live inside when he'd come over. They'd only just managed to do that a couple of weeks before I went to see them. And, you know, I said, look, I'll do everything I can to help, because the dog had sort of separation anxiety, as well as obviously, you know, just generalized anxiety as well, and a few other things. And one of the things they said to me was that he kept attacking other dogs. And I've had this a few times where it's like where a dog is attacking another dog, and it's not always going to be the case, but it seems to be in the ones that I work with, is where effectively what's happened is somewhere along the line, the owner or somebody within the household has been attacked in some way. And that might not necessarily be physically, you know, it could be that they've been verbally attacked, or they've been bullied or abused, or, you know, I have had it where somebody was attacked, somebody had come up behind them and you know, put them in a headlock, that kind of thing. And so often again, it's very much like I'm tuning into my intuition, and I'll just know that that's the question I need to ask. And the thing is because I'm trained in the human therapies and the animal therapies, it can mean then that obviously we don't just help the dog, we're actually then helping the person, because we basically work through and start releasing these traumas and being able to let them go. Because, you know, when we've been through something that is traumatic, if we've not been able to work through it at that moment in time, for whatever reason, that could be shock, it could be that it's not the time or place to do so, you know, or that it's not safe to do so, depending on who's around us or where you are, we suppress it. So it's then in the cells of our body. So of course what we're then doing is helping, you know, these owners release this trauma so that they're not holding on to it. And then often what will happen is when they start releasing that, or start releasing the things that are making them feel anxious and so on, is actually the pet's behavior will start to calm down. It will start to kind of shift and change. It won't necessarily kind of go from, you know, happening to not, because you've always got layers. You know, but it shows the owner, right, okay, so if you've released that and they've started to lessen the behavior that they were doing or not doing, then, you know, actually you can see there's a correlation. So if we keep working with you, we're then working with them. But sometimes it can also be that when people haven't been able to heal their own stuff, if you like, their own unhealed wounds, it can also be that when you're working, actually some aspect of it is them when they start being more compassionate with themselves and loving towards themselves, they then change their attitude towards their pet. So like I had one family who had a particular type of dog that instead of walking across the floor, because it was decked laminate flooring, if you like, in the living room, he would choose to leap over the settee and people that were on it. And somebody in the household said, oh, he's an absolute knob, excuse my language, but that's the word that they used. And I, you know, one of the questions I said is, okay, I assume from what you're saying that you're maybe not very compassionate with yourself, because you're not very compassionate with your dog, and actually you know, having more of an attitude of curiosity of why they might be doing this. And actually for the dog, it was the fact that actually laminate flooring equals skating rink. Equals, you know, when I'm going across it, I'm having to compensate with tension in my body because it doesn't feel safe. That's causing muscle problems and everything else. So the safest way of me doing it is actually I'm just going to jump from the hallway onto the settee, go round, and then
Yeah.
I've got my spot without skidding across the floor.
Yeah.
So sometimes it can be more on that level. So it's not always direct mirrors, but sometimes it's still involving you, you know, because it's like, okay, this is showing up that you're not compassionate with them, you're therefore not compassionate with yourself. You know, if people are judging their pet, like a lot of people say, oh, they're really needy, you know, so anything that they dislike in their pet very often is something they dislike in themselves to a certain level, i.e. if they're saying, oh, my pet's needy, I hate it, goodness sake, ugh. Often there's an aspect of them that is needy that they're not recognizing or accepting, and actually are again judging. And often when you judge that part of you that is needy, then that creates certain emotions. It's like if somebody hated you for something about yourself, a quality, you'd feel those emotions, and that would make you feel a certain way. And it's similar with ourselves. So that needy part of somebody is going to suddenly feel perhaps very shamed, you know, and maybe angry that, you know, well, why can't I, you know, why can't I be me, and things like that. So it can get quite in depth, as you've just heard. But yeah, again, hopefully that explains a lot more how I work.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? And it's and this is one thing that I always talk about with my agility training and my academy and stuff, is because it's like we need to work with the human as much as we do with the dog, because we are like connected, and they are going to pick up on everything. I think a lot of it when it comes to dog training, especially something like agility, we're so focused on the end result, we're so focused on the dog. And I always say to people, it's like, it's not always as simple as, you know, because every time you stand on that start line, you might have 4 runs in a day, and every time you stand on that start line, both you and your dog are going to feel a completely different way potentially. There's different things that are happening, there's different, you know, emotions going on, there's so many different variables. And I think sometimes that's a lot for people to get their head around, is to kind of think, well, actually this is more to do with me, isn't it? Because we think about traditional dog training and everything's on the dog, and then they're putting this pressure on the dog, and you know, and it's so interesting. Like you say, it's one of these subjects I could talk about forever, because there is so much that I'm like, let's just look a little bit closer to home, and knowing it from a, you know, from a lived experience as well as other knowledge and stuff. It's like I see it all the time in me and my dog and stuff. And like you say, it's not a simple we work on this and it fixes, because our emotions vary, and you know, all the things we're going through, especially women, especially neurodivergent, especially women of a certain age any age going through different cycles during a month, and they pick up on absolutely everything. I think sometimes we give them a hard time. We just expect the dogs to be like robots, and that, you know, they have to be this certain way, but we don't actually give ourselves that compassion. I said when people start to understand about this connection, whether it's a pet dog or whether it's an agility dog or whatever, or any other animal, although I have very limited knowledge of other animals, that's why I'm talking about dogs all the time. It's like, it's understanding, it's that connection. If you're living with somebody for that amount of time, you are going to pick up on other people's things, isn't it? And it's getting that through to the owners that actually let's just look at you a little bit more.
I mean, I think, you know, people are often, it's like that fear of what people think, isn't it? I think a lot of that comes at fear of judgment, and I totally get it, you know, I do totally get it. But the things is that actually, you know, if you want me to help your pets, or somebody that's, you know, like me, the thing is it's, you know, I'm not judging somebody. I'm there to just say, wow, look at this, you know, look at this gift they are giving you. It might not feel like a gift, but it is, you know, they're showing you that there's something within you that might need healing, or sometimes it's just that they're showing you about accepting a side of you that maybe you've been shamed for before. You know, often that needy part of it is in a child that maybe never got the attention that it needed, you know, back in our lives, things like that, you know. So it's a beautiful gift if we look at it in that way, rather than, you know, fearing that we're going to be judged for it, or feeling ashamed. But I always say to people, well, even if you do feel ashamed, that's stuff for us to work with. It's as simple as that. Definitely. If you feel ashamed for actually needing attention or having needs, like, well, we all have needs, you know, in the world, you know. So so again, it's something that we can look at. And so I think that does come into it quite a lot, is you know, oh yeah, no, it's not my fault. And often again, it's like, well, if you're trying to kind of stay away from that, then I suspect, especially the way people will say things, you know, to me, I'll be like, okay, do you often believe that things are your fault? because you're trying to push me away from that like you couldn't believe. So again, then that's something that you can work with, you know, because often again that comes down to like childhood trauma and things like that. So you can work with it on that level. And I mean, I've done it with other people where it seems like they'll write me an email, and it might be either telling me in the beginning about obviously what's going on, or it might be, you know, when we've had 1 or 2 sessions. And often they'll write, you know, Fluffy does not like visitors. Fluffy really doesn't like change. You know, Fluffy gets very anxious when, you know, there isn't a structure in place and things aren't organised. And often I will just go back to people and say, okay, I want you to take out Fluffy's name. And I want you to put your name in there, and then I want you to read that email back and notice what you notice, because quite often people will project as well in some respects, and actually it's actually also them, you know, quite often it might be that their pet doesn't like visitors and change and so on, but again it's sort of to do with that group bond as well. So again, I just go back to them and go, okay, you know, like sub their name for yours and see what resonates. So that's another way of doing it that can be a little bit more subtle, and again, you know, gives people time to sort of do that themselves. But it's something that I look at with people all the time because I know it's there.
Yeah, definitely. And there was a saying that goes around in the dog world a little bit, that they always say that you don't get the dog you want, you get the dog you need. And I was like, and especially when I can relate it to all 3 of my dogs, every single one I've got, especially Quest, because to be quite honest, I thought, you know, being in agility for a long time, I was like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, he's just gonna come out and he's just gonna be, you know, fantastic agility, you know, no problems whatsoever. And then he turned into this anxious, I mean, yes, circumstances, end of COVID, that kind of thing, that played a part of it. However, he wasn't the one that just came out of the womb and instantly did agility. We had to work on all of the other things, especially anxiety, and then my anxiety, and there's a pressure of me being a trainer and having this dog that wasn't, just coming out of the womb and doing agility. But actually what it led me to do is to completely change my whole business in some respects. So I focus on, that's kind of like a niche area that goes down, anxious handlers, anxious dogs, those kind of things. And if it wasn't for him giving me the practical examples and look, this is what he's dealing with, this is what I'm dealing with, this is what we're working on together, my business wouldn't have gone in that way. So now I'm very much a believer of everything kind of happens for a reason. And then when people say you don't get the dog you want, you get the dog you need, I'm like, you've been sent here to push my business in this way, because it's always what I've wanted to do, and it's always what I've loved doing, is all the intricacies of agility, not the skills. But I wasn't kind of like confident enough to just go out there and push myself out there until he came along, and I'm like, well, look, this is what we're doing, kind of thing. So yeah, I'm definitely a massive believer in that.
I mean, I had a lady very similar actually with her horse, and I went to see her, and I think the horse was she was just basically saying she wanted him to be more of a competitive horse. And like when I was working, I just kept getting this, I don't want to do this. No, this isn't what I want to do. And you know, we worked with this horse and they were showing us different things, and it was really like they were really nervous about connecting with like other beings, if you like, whether that was pets or people. And we managed to, there was a yard cat, if you like, that was there, and they were so nervous, and I managed to, I realised, because I kept staring at this cat and sort of, you know, and I was like, do you want to connect with her? Do you want to say hello? And the horse was sort of looking at me, and at one point they kind of nodded, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. It's always when you're not recording it, you know, and you're like, darn it. And I said, oh, it's okay, you can go up to her. And he sort of went up to her and he sort of did that, and of course she nearly fell off the fence, you know, so of course she swiped him. And I had to say to her, you know, and then no, darling, because you could see him back off. And how upset he was. So again, it was this real mirror of, okay, so does somebody fear rejection because the horse is showing this aspect, you know, so does the owner fear rejection? Okay, so we'll pocket that and come back to that. And again, it was just saying to him, okay, darling, you're quite big, she's quite small, so you know, you need to just gently, you know. And he did, and I said to him, that's it, just really gentle and let her come to you. And she was rubbing him, and afterwards he was literally doing this like happy dance with his hooves. And it was so lovely to see. And it then kind of got us onto this topic of, you know, I said to her, he wants to look after like the horses in the field. I said he's more of a caring, like nurturing horse. I said I feel like that's what he wants to do more of. You know, I said possibly even like pet therapy, like that kind of way. I said, but he's not a competitive horse. You know, that's not his bag. And then suddenly the owner started to realize that actually the reason she was trying to push that way was to kind of prove to somebody in the family that what she was doing was proper, if you like, proper job and all of that kind of thing. And there was just so much more depth to it. So absolutely, you know, it can happen with any pet where they are sort of, as you say, kind of reflecting back, and it's not always in like the negative way of like, you know, they're anxious, you're anxious sort of thing, and that's still not negative. They're still showing us something that we need to heal. But sometimes it can be like, you know, with the dog I saw recently, it's showing, you know, it's saying to that person, I don't have a purpose, and hey, you don't have a purpose, and you've lost direction. And, you know, like with that horse, actually, it was also saying to the owner, you don't have to try and fit into somebody else's box and do what they want you to do just because that's what they believe you should do. You need to do what's right for you in life, you know. So they will teach us things like that, or to be more in the now, to be more present. So it's I love it, and like you, I could talk about it for ages.
Amazing. So we've spoken a little bit about it earlier on, about how pets can sometimes reflect on the owner's like physical issues. So how does that look like in practice for you, and how do you approach helping the humans with that kind of side of things?
So it depends what it is, really, in that regard. So I did have one lady that she actually came to see me for herself originally, so she was a human client, and she actually said to me, can I ask you something about animals, because I know you work with them? I said yes. And she said, I think my pet took on somebody else's illness. And I was like, right, okay. And actually it wasn't long after I'd started to already think that they can take our energy. And so I was like, okay, this is interesting, let's see where this goes. So I said to her, what do you mean? She said, well, my dog was a therapy dog. And I said, okay. And she said, he was looking after a little girl. I said, okay. And I said, well, what did the little girl have? And she said, stomach cancer. And I said, okay. And what did your dog pass from? And she said, stomach cancer.
Wow.
And you know, I said to her, well, I'm getting goosebumps, and goosebumps normally on a universal level means truth. I said, obviously there's no way of us proving, absolutely not. But it's not the first time I've heard of it. So I've heard that several times. There's one instance that I won't share publicly, just because if the person that it was about ever heard it, it wouldn't be conducive to them hearing it, just because it was a sensitive situation. So I don't want to share that one in particular. But there are other situations I've come across where, again, there's been a physical condition that suddenly appeared within the pet, a physical condition that's basically the same appeared within the owner, but on a mild version. The pet has actually taken the brunt of it, in a sense, and passed with that condition, where the owner has then continued onwards. And like with this lady with, you know, the little girl and the doggy, I said to her, well, the thing is that what we as humans struggle with is the detachment, the unconditional love, that on a soul level, you know, your dog and that little girl's soul may have chosen to come in together in a way that he helps that energy like be released, such that little girl can go and do what she needs to do within the world. That could be like the next eco warrior, the next prime minister, and so on. You know, so it does depend, because obviously in that case there wasn't really anything to do other than allow the owner to see it from a different perspective, in that sense. With like living pets, where like I had one lady where we looked at allergies. So she had allergies, the dog had allergies, you know. Normally what I will go to with the physical conditions, I will go straight to the metaphysical book, which is like Yvette's book is absolutely incredible, and has a lot of information in there about kind of the emotions that underlie some physical conditions, because we know that other things can create physical conditions. So that's why I'm saying it doesn't mean that condition is always, you know, created by an emotion. But, you know, when we are not, so our higher self speaks to us through our emotions. When we don't listen to them for whatever reason, it starts to use the physical vehicle, the physical body, to try and get that message to us. So this is kind of also where it comes into this. So I tend to look at that message then of, you know, what are the metaphysics of the condition, what are the emotions underlying it, the beliefs, and I tend to go through that with an owner, and we start looking at that, and then we can start drumming down into the more specifics of, you know, if it's to do with, like, say, anger and resentment. Okay, so where does this relate to? And we start to work with that. So with physical conditions, it's more on that level that we're starting to get the owner, probably more so than the pet, to actually look at, obviously, you know, that element of it and seeing where we can release it. Sometimes the physical, you know, the physical condition, it might be, say, you know, that the dog's got a pain in their neck and the owner's got a pain in their neck, you know, and again, obviously I would be looking at the metaphysics of that, but sometimes I'm always I'm asking people, has anything happened that's, for instance, created that? Because sometimes it may well be, and normally if there's physical conditions, I do say to people, you need to visit your vet first to ensure that obviously there's no pain, there's no injuries, there's no, you know, issues on that level that need to be dealt with. Because I have had people say to me, you know, my pet is you know, paralyzed on their back legs, can you communicate with them? And I've had to say to them, no, you need to actually ring your vet and tell them there's possibly an emergency coming down, and tell them exactly what you just told me. And I will, like, literally put that boundary in and say, no, that is veterinary assistance, 100% take them. So it does depend what it is. But as I say, like with one of them that I had, it was actually to do with that the dog had clotheslined the lead, creating whiplash. So that was a vet visit. That was basically, he won't let me. So I do have energy techniques that I can work with. So depending again on the energy of that condition, it may well be that we can release an element of it or all of it through, say, energy healing, sound healing. So we can work on that level, especially with things. So I work more with conditions if there's an emotional aspect underlying it. So say I'm just trying to think of one. So I had one pet, for instance, that got attacked by another dog. So that's trauma to the body, to the cells of the body. You've got the emotions as well within that, and shock, and often anger. And so those kind of ones, like very acute, I suppose, is what we'd call it. So I can work with that. Like sound healing is really good for that, to actually help release the shock from the body and the energy of the trauma, and so on. If it's something that's already, like, you know, something quite chronic, or as I say, something that requires veterinary assistance, then absolutely I just send them to the vets. So it is different in different contexts, but as I say, like with, I mean, even with, you know, even with pets, you know, with ours it was more of a mirror. So you know, again, with her, obviously, yes, it was veterinary assistance and me working with what I do, but also some pets, that's their role. They will take energy from you, and like with Puss, no matter how much I said to her, please don't take energy from me. You know, if I've had an argument with somebody and I'm like angry and stressed and, you know, like fuming, don't take that energy from me. And for those that kind of wondering what I'm talking about here, emotion is energy in motion. Okay, so, you know, any emotion is an energy. So, you know, I've had to say to her, don't take it, but she still took it. And literally the day after, got diagnosed with a condition, which when I looked up the metaphysics, I was like, yeah, absolutely, that's the argument. 100%, you know. And I said to her, it's easier for me to work with you. It's easier for me to work with myself with the anger and whatever's been produced than it is for me with her. But her role was, I'm going to take that. And there's nothing you can do about it. So some pets, some people might say it's stubborn, but some pets, that's their role, is I'm going to take energy from you and there's not anything you can do about it. That's my role. Whereas with some, you can kind of explain to them, look, if you continue taking this could potentially lead to your passing. So you know, so there's kind of different ways to deal with kind of different issues on a more physical level, but as I say, if it's more something like it's you know, they've been in a road traffic accident, or they've had like a dog attack or something like that, where it's quite simple, it's not complicated, it's like that one situation has now created, like, you know, a problem with their leg, then unless it's something structural, which of course wouldn't be my bag, then if it's more of an emotional kind of aspect, then we can work with that. It doesn't actually mean we can fully release it or put it back to the health, you know, that it would have been, because obviously if you've had a broken leg, like, it's never going to fix the same way as when it wasn't broken, kind of thing, at the end of the day. So sometimes it won't necessarily be a case of we can remove something completely, but, you know, quite often, as I say, you can definitely work with the trauma and start releasing that from the body. And obviously the quicker you get to that, the better, because it hasn't had time to kind of lodge in, and then everything else starts to compensate because of that. So Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. And I know one of the things you talked about earlier that you help people with is pets that have passed. Could you, this might be quite a new concept to a lot of the listeners, because it's not something that's commonly out there, is it, in the work, in the dog world especially. So could you walk us through a little bit of what that involves and what how that benefits both like the person, the human, really?
Yeah, of course. So often, when pets pass, people will struggle. And that might be that they're struggling with the loss of that pet. It might be that because of that, they're struggling with other things in their life. So that could be that they're, not functioning very well at work, or, their relationship's breaking down. Maybe they've blamed the other person in the relationship or whatever. They might have regrets. Often people might carry guilt. Quite often people say, should I've done it sooner? Should I've done it later? It might be things that they weren't able to be there for their pet for whatever reason. And so they're holding on to all of that guilt. Oh my God, they'll think I've abandoned them. So the way I work is kind of it's kind of trifold in some respects, but we'll go with the simplest version. So firstly, we're working with the triggers that are coming up for somebody. So a bit like I've just mentioned, that list of, so it's gonna be the shoulds. People should on themselves a lot. Should I have done this? Should I have done that? Should I have taken them to a referral centre? Should I have done it a day earlier, and so on? So we work with the shoulds and the guilt, because again, it's often indicative of something else further back that they've been carrying. So we work with that, and sometimes it can even go back to past lives, which I know we're going to come on to. But so I tend to work with that element as well. So we work with the emotional release, and then within the emotional release, it can be beliefs that they've been carrying, like it's my fault. For instance, I should have done this. That's still a belief. So we work with elements of that. But the other thing that I do is I communicate with pets in spirit. So I am a medium. I've always, obviously, as a medium, communicated with our loved ones in spirit. And when my own cat passed in 2016, I was so bereft that, to be honest, if I'd had a superpower that meant I could blow the four walls out of the building I lived in, it would have happened 100%, and all I wanted was for a medium to bring her through and say, she's sitting next to you, or she's curled up on your lap and she's okay. And of course, nobody did that. But I had seen certain mediums say, oh, I've got a horse here and they're brown and they're this and they're that. And I suppose because of my background in the vet referral industry, I was very much like, well, I know quite a lot of the breeds. I don't know all of them, but I've got quite a good idea. I'd love to be able to say to somebody, oh, I've got a brown mastiff here, or I've got a cockapoo, or, things like that, to sort of be more specific, rather than I've got a small, a medium, or a large size dog, So I ended up actually training myself. I did case studies and said, well, if we can bring loved ones through from spirit on a soul level, why can't we do the same thing with pets? Because they are a soul, they are a sentient being. When they pass away, their soul goes back to the spirit realm. So why can't we do that? So I did the case studies, and to my surprise, they worked, and people could take the information that I was bringing through. So I then decided to actually bring that element into my business, and I'm focusing a lot more these days on the pet bereavement element of things, to assist people, when it is such a difficult time. So I do the mediumship with pets. So I basically, it is animal communication effectively. We're working with the spirit of that pet, the soul of that pet. And I'll bring through things, not just like their personality, but also things like, do they have any memories they'd like to share with their owners? Has their owner experienced them from spirit? Because very often, again, people have experienced their pet from spirit. And what I mean by that is that they've seen them in their peripheral vision, like, out the corner of their eye, and they've just seen that, oh my God. And then they turn back and they're like, oh, must have just been me. And it isn't, it's your pet showing you that they are there for that split second. They're showing you, because actually if they did appear in front of people, they'd be like, whoa, they don't want to do that. They don't want to frighten you. So they might have seen them, or they might have heard them. So I've had people that have heard their horses neigh, and they didn't have any other horses around, so it couldn't have been that. Or I've had people hear their claws clattering across the laminate flooring, or feel them sitting on the bed like they used to do. Like I get it with Puss, she Bless her, she had to be put to sleep 26th of March this year, so it's still quite raw. But she showed me herself sitting on the dining table, for instance. It's one of the things I've heard her literally pad into the living room, which is what she used to do. And I don't have any other pets, and there's nothing that would have created that noise in the same way at all. And it was at the same time that she would do it nearly every day. So I've had that. I've had her jump up onto the bed, so I've felt her on the bed. I've actually felt her or like an impression of her, a visual of her. It was a bit of everything, of where she used to sleep on the bed with me. So so the communications are really about, as I say, like helping people, you know, we ask the questions. So I do ask people if they've got like up to 3 questions they'd like to ask their pet, because if people do have like any regrets or they're carrying guilt, things like that, sometimes actually that communication and what the pet says back to them can actually help them just completely let go of that guilt, not even in a sense needing to kind of resolve it, but they just release it because they realize they don't need to feel guilty. So I work in a very healing way with it. So yes, it's proving that there is evidence of life after death, or after physical death, but it's also bringing through messages. So I always ask the pet for a message as well for their owner. And again, some of those can like just blow your mind when they say things, but also the evidence that they need, that actually, yes, I'm communicating with their pet, and also things to make them laugh. Sometimes, you know, it's happy, you know, happy memories of holidays they've had together and things like that. So I work on that level, but that's the main way I work in terms of pet bereavement. But I do also work in a couple of other ways, which is actually I can work with a living pet who has lost another pet in the household to spirit, and that living pet is struggling as well as the owner. So I can work with the owner and the pet in that guise. And I have done that with a lovely Ridgie, who'd lost her brother. And I actually did canine hypnotherapy with her and actually brought him close to her and told her again that she could do that. And it was so lovely to see her relaxing and releasing. She was a completely different dog after that session. It was really beautiful. But also if an owner has passed a spirit, which obviously can happen as well, then I can also actually like bring the connection of the owner in spirit to the pets and the owner that are struggling in this life. So that's why I said it's trifold, because it can be a living pet, a past pet, or obviously a past owner as well.
Amazing. So super interesting, isn't it? And I know from like being neurodivergent and running a business as a neurodivergent professional, and one of the things that I've massively struggled with myself is the confrontation, or the, you know, like RSD comes in. Have you ever found that in your business where people haven't been as open to, you know, what you're suggesting? I mean, obviously, you know, we align people that are going to come to us and want our services and stuff, but have you ever been in situations where, you know, that side of things, you've had to deal with a confrontation, and how have you dealt with that? So like I say, for me as a neurodivergent person, I used to always hate confrontation and avoid it like anything. So have you had any of those kind of experiences with what you do?
I have. I mean, for those that don't know, RSD is rejection sensitivity disorder, isn't it? So I mean, certainly there was to start with. And I think with anything, like for me, it's always been about having to work on myself. If there's triggers in whatever guise around the work that I do, then it's, to me, I always try and walk my talk. There's no point saying to other people to heal your stuff. You know, heal your wounds if I'm not doing it myself. So I'm always kind of working with those triggers. But certainly, you know, I have had that fear of rejection before. And again, it is one that for me, it's been an element of working on it on a very somatic level, so on a cellular level, but also on a kind of more cognitive and perspective level as well. So I do remember someone around me saying, well, how are you being rejected by not putting yourself out there? You know, because actually if you don't put yourself out there because you fear rejection, then the people that actually really want to work with you, you're going to be rejected because they're not going to see you. And I was like, that's a really good point. So that's one thing that I really took on board from that gentleman, you know, was him saying that to me, was coach around me. So that's the first thing. And secondly, I mean, these days I tend to kind of go, if somebody is, sorry, I've just had a beautiful kitty come in. You know, if somebody wants to work with me, fantastic, and if they don't, then they're maybe just not ready. Because I think that's the thing, when you're neurodivergent, often you see things that are there that other people don't see. And so it's a bit like, I'm at Z, they're at A, and again, there's no judgment in that, but there's no way they're going to catch up to you you know, just by saying, well, that's how it is, or trying to explain it to them.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that's why I kind of do that kind of the layering of, there's education, so people can, you know, I've done webinars on, you know, pets are our mirrors and messengers, so that's a really good way of people starting to then just observe more and become aware of more things. And otherwise I think it's me changing my perspective, very much so, of, you know, me feeling into whether that person is ready to work with me. Because the thing is that I have worked with, you know, many people where they've not been ready to work on their own stuff. They've not even been ready to accept, like you said earlier, that actually they have an influence here. There is their part to play in this. And they just say to me, you just need to fix the cat, the dog, the horse, whatever. And so now I manage that expectation, say, look, I can work with your pet. But if the influence is coming from you, all I'm going to keep doing is emptying their bucket of emotions, and you keep filling it up. So if you've got like an endless supply of money and you want me to keep working with your pet, I'm okay doing that, but I do want to manage your expectations there, because the whole thing for me is you healing and then being able to go on your way together in a whole, you know, much more understanding and compassionate and aware level without needing my help, you know. So I suppose to answer your question, yes, absolutely, I've had the fear of rejection. But at the same station now, I kind of generally are like, if people reject me, I kind of go, then I wouldn't have wanted to work with them anyway, if they're rejecting that. And again, I'm not judging them for that, but just more a case of, if you've got someone that's resistant already to what you're doing or skeptical, there's no point. I've done it in the past where in the early days I was sort of trying to prove, if you like, and I've got past that point now. I've seen enough for me to know for myself that it's absolutely valid. So and I have worked with somebody that was skeptical, and I did, like, at the time I did like a 3-hour communication, and there was also somebody on that call who I knew and they knew. And what happened was, just because one thing wasn't mentioned by that pet, they just said, nah, none of it's, I don't believe you, none of it's valid, none of it's true. And actually when they left the call, I spoke to this person that we were both connected to, and they said to me, they said that person could have taken everything, they just weren't willing to. And so again, if I can feel that somebody is skeptical and they're not open to working in this way, there's just no point working with them. And normally then it's a case of, okay, so is there anybody else that I might recommend they work with? You know, and that could be a behaviorist or a trainer, depending on, you know. But again, it's similar, like you've had the experience of it. Most behaviorists, most trainers, you know, in certain situations will go, yeah, I know this is to do with the owner. And so yes, definitely, the fear of rejection has been there, but I think the more you know yourself and know what you do is true and believe in yourself on that level, then the less somebody rejecting what you're saying will have an impact on you, in my experience. And these days I tend to kind of do a bit of a dip the toe in the water. So if I'm, you know, like I was at an event recently, and you don't know quite who's going to come through those doors, you don't know who's going to be open to the spiritual aspect of this or not. So it was just a case of, okay, I'm going to just feel into it with each person, you know. And generally, if once they came up to me and said, okay, what is it you do, generally from me saying back what I did, you can kind of get a feel whether they're open to it. The same as if I'm around people, you know, I'll often say to them, well, you can always ask the angels for a parking space, and I'll start with something just like really simple and really like non-confrontational, you know, judgy, and again, like their response to that, like, oh, okay, they're open to it, or okay, you know, I think that's as far as we take that today. So and I think it's also having boundaries as well. You know, I did have somebody recently at an event who wanted to dictate to me the way they felt I should be doing pet mediumship. And I basically did stand my boundary and said, that's not how I do it. I appreciate that might be your view, that might be your perspective. That's not how I do it. You know, and so I didn't move. I didn't turn around and go, well, I'll do it that way then, because then that's me not being me, and it's not going to work. You know, I need to do it the way that I do it. But there might be other people out there that communicate with pets in spirit, in that particular way. And it's so again, I think it's also knowing your own boundaries, your own value, isn't it?
Yes.
Because I think if we fear rejection, then it's like maybe there's an element of us that's already rejecting ourselves, or we're very sensitive to that because we've been rejected in the past. So again, it's like, what do we need to work on? Where have we been rejected before for being ourselves? So it can go quite deep.
Yeah, definitely. And there's always so many layers to everything, isn't there? And that's why I find this topic so fascinating. It's just like everything that I do in all angles of my business. There's always I always refer to it as a jigsaw because it's so easier for people to understand. There's so many little different pieces, and it's like finding the ones that are individual for that person, that situation, regardless of what we're doing. So to finish off, really, if anybody's listening to this and then thinking that I feel like my pet is trying to tell me something, but I'm not quite sure like where I go with this, where would you suggest they begin with things like that? Where could they start with? You know, they just know they've just got this feeling that the pet's trying to tell them something, but that's as far as they've got.
So yeah, I was thinking about this. So I mean, one of the things that you can do is what I said earlier, really. So breath work would be quite a quick one to do. So it takes like 5 minutes to just sit and just take longer exhales, because longer exhales activates the relaxation response in your nervous system. So obviously, if you are feeling anxious, stressed, anything, you know, above kind of neutrality, if you like, then obviously you can then start to see, like after 5 minutes, if you open your eyes and your pet's like, you know, and then normally then you're like, okay, so when I'm more relaxed they are. So that's a really good kind of technique to use. Other ones they can do is things like, you know, actually just sitting back and saying, okay, what might they be trying to tell me? So like one of the core motivators of behaviors in pets is to keep energy moving through the body. So what comes in has got to go out. And if we bear in mind, and this is an elongated answer to the question, but if we bear in mind that actually they sense the world through electromagnetic fields, you know, we are an electromagnetic field, our emotions are, you know, so are all the things like Wi-Fi and the electrical appliances we have in the home. It's worth like people starting to look at, okay, how am I feeling? You know, so again, close your eyes, just feel into how you're feeling in that moment. You know, looking around the environment, you know, is it a case you've moved their bed, say, next to the Wi-Fi, and suddenly their behaviour has changed since you've been doing that? Or you've moved home and your home has you know, the electric pylon lines over it, like that can, I mean, if I walk under pylons, it does my head in. It's like having a vice against my head. I can't stand it. I have to get out of there. So you can imagine, you know, given that pets are far more sensitive than we are, if I feel like that, flipping heck, how are they going to feel? So it's worth looking at the environment. Has anything changed in the environment that could have created this? But yeah, definitely look at things like observe, like don't judge. So that's the other thing that I've written here: observe, don't judge, and just step and go, what might they be trying to tell me? So because actually if their behavior is, say, bashing their paws against the back door and they just keep doing it, they're trying to express the energy, they're trying to get the energy out. Okay, so who in the household has got a lot of emotion going on right now? Or, you know, has there been an argument recently that's gone on and there's unresolved emotions? And actually I feel like I need to say this because it came in earlier and then I left it and then it's come back in again. It's actually similar to vet surgery. So if there's any vets or vet nurses listening to this, or even kennel assistants or anybody like that, it also happens in vets. If you had, say, a vet and a nurse that have had an argument, or two nurses or whatever, but there's an interaction between two people that have had an argument and there is unresolved emotions, the pets in that clinic, especially the ones that you are physically working with in that moment, will pick up that unresolved anger. If you're like, no, they shouldn't have spoken to me like that, blah, 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 you know, you may get a pet that suddenly then lashes out at the person you are angry with. You know, and I've had to say that before and say they also pick up on that. So again, like, we've got to be responsible for what we're holding. So I felt like I needed to say it because it came in again. So I was like, right, I've got to say it. But yeah, so observation, you know, become aware. Don't, you know, don't get into that thing of like, oh God, no, it can't be me. Actually, it might be you, but what an amazing gift that they're giving you and they're showing you. I mean, other than that, as I say, like it's more about getting into specifics, and often that comes through the animal communication and the work that I do. But yeah, I think it is stepping back, observing, maybe do the breath work, even like actually what I said earlier, that's the other one. It's maybe write a paragraph about your pet and don't like filter it, like just free flow it and
Mm,
write it down. And then when you said like their name or my pet, substitute my pet for your name,
yeah,
or my heart, so my
yeah,
pet, is really needy. It really winds me up. My God, why does he just have to cling to me all the time? And actually, if you substitute, Richard is really needy and so clingy. Like, why does he have to cling to me all the time? That is showing you that you're not accepting a part of you that might be needy and why you might be needy.
yeah,
So again, people can then look at, well, what needs are not being met within me,
yeah,
because we have to meet our own needs,
yeah,
um so they're the ones that kind of popped into my head. Breathwork's probably the easiest out of all of them,
yeah,
to be fair. So it's a good one for people to use, especially if it's an emotional issue,
yeah,
because if there's an emotional issue like stress, anxiety, etc.,
yeah,
it's a good one. But definitely observing the environments. Has something changed? And it could literally be as simple as you put the Christmas tree up and they are acting all erratic and stuff. Okay, well, that is a change. So is your pet trying to say that actually they struggle with change, and therefore, again, the question to ask is, does that reflect on me? Do I struggle with change?
yeah, yeah,
you
definitely.
know and the change for you might not actually be the Christmas tree, but it might be that your association to that Christmas tree is, I've got a whole family coming over and I've got to suddenly get a big table out, and oh my God, it's going to be really noisy and I struggle with noise. And
Mm,
so them kind of being really funny around the Christmas tree could
yeah,
just be their way of saying, yeah, it's the association you have with that object of what's
yeah.
running through your mind. So I hope that helps. It might have overwhelmed everybody
Yeah.
completely, but that's,
No, it's fascinating. I think that the main thing as well is to get curious, isn't it? Get curious and be
yeah,
open-minded, and then you get in touch with people like yourselves and stuff that do that work. And we're going to give people the opportunity to do that in a minute, by telling them how they get in touch with you. But to finish off with, so people can get to know you a little bit better, I'm going to ask you 5 quick fire questions. Um,
okay.
I think the answer to the first one is probably going to be neither, because you did mention it earlier on. So the first one is tea or coffee.
Okay, well, yes, I don't have caffeine. I
Yeah,
do have it, I just don't have it often. So if I was going to say, I would choose tea.
yeah, same here. I'm
Yeah.
similar. So, what's one tool or app that you can't live without in your business? So, from a business perspective, what is it that you use?
Goodness. Oh my goodness, I can't live without. That's not a quick fire question. I can't do that one. Probably zero my accounts package, because
Yeah,
it's obviously much easier than anything else. So yeah,
yeah,
that's probably yeah,
go
we'll
with
go with
that
that.
one. So, what's a hobby or interest that you have outside of work that people might not expect?
Um, they might not expect. So, gosh. Everything I do is probably quite similar to what I already do. Singing, I'll go with that one, because obviously I don't generally sing to the animals, not
Yeah,
as part of my session. So I love singing
yeah,
and acting. So I've acted since I was a little bubba, and
amazing,
did panto for several years. But yeah, I love acting, but I really love singing. So
amazing, amazing. So, are you a morning person or a night owl?
night owl, 100%. But
Yeah,
apparently, that I'm going to throw in a thing there. Apparently, actually, it's often to do with the time you were born. So I've
oh right,
noticed a pattern of, actually, if you were born more in the evening, so I was born 5:55 in the evening, which
yeah,
numerologically is like, ooh. But, and also another friend of mine who's a night owl as well, they were also born in the evening. So
yeah,
maybe look at what time you were born, because I think it's
yeah.
often like, if you're born in the morning, you're more of a morning person. But I could be wrong, you
Yeah,
know.
I'm gonna have a look. I'm gonna find out what time I was born.
Yeah, so I'd be
So
interested to know if that is a pattern. So,
yeah, definitely. And the last one, what's your favorite way to recharge after a busy day?
oh, definitely nature. Well, nature or animals, to be fair, even if I've been with animals. So
Yeah,
nature is yeah, and combine the two, nature and animals together, amazing.
amazing. And then to finish off with, the most important question is, how can people get in touch with you, and how can they want to work with you if they want to dive deeper into all of the things we've talked about?
Okay, so they can find me on social media.
Mhm,
So I'm on Facebook as Amatrine Holistics Limited,
mhm.
on a Facebook page, or my own profile, Victoria Smith-Gillard. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, and I have my website, which is www.amatrineholistics.co.uk. And again, you've got the social media links there, and there's lots of blogs and information of what I do. Or they can just email me at victoria@amatrineholistics.co.uk.
Amazing. And what we'll do is put all the links underneath the podcast, so anybody that's listening can just simply click and get in touch with you. So thank you very much for coming on. It's been amazing talking to you, and it's something that I feel like as well we could do, you know, a 2-part, 3-part, 4-part series on all of the things that we, you know, we've just scratched the surface, hasn't it, when we've come to talking about all of these things. So I really appreciate your time and coming on and educating the listeners a little bit more about things that aren't always talked about. So thank you again from me. And if you are listening to the podcast for the first time, make sure you hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. So it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Victoria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.